Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. During 2021, the State Historical Society is commemorating the upcoming 175th anniversary of Iowa's statehood. In March, which is Iowa History Month, the Iowa History 101 webinar series expands to every Tuesday and Thursday. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Today we will learn about the industrialization and Americanization of Midwesterners' diets to explain how changes in farming, technology, and culture have influenced the Iowa dinner plate. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are now available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Amaya Mieha. Amaya is an associate professor of history at Drake University. She has a PhD from the University of Missouri and is an environmental historian interested in the relationship between American societies and their lands and resources. Amaya is the author of A River in the City of Fountains, an environmental history of Kansas City and the Missouri River, which examines the city's decades-long management of the river for often conflicting purposes of commerce and public health. Since joining Drake in 2007, she has taught courses about the American West, food, public health, and urban environmental history. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Amaya to begin the webinar.
Thank you so much, and I'm so glad to be here. I'm going to keep my camera off for the duration, but I wanted to just let you know I'm a real person on the other side, and I know there are a number of real people on the other side of this as well. Let's get started. So my topic today is food. And to examine the Midwestern diet, we also have to examine agriculture. The industrialization of the American diet is well underway by the late 19th century, but there's this correlating trend in agriculture. And these are changes that can be seen in cities and farms alike. So the shifts that are happening at the urban dinner table are due in part to shifts that are happening in rural communities. And it doesn't happen overnight, but by the end of the 20th century, American agriculture and the American diet have dramatically shifted, whether you live in Brooklyn, Iowa, or Brooklyn, New York. And I'd like to start with a recent book by Kristen Hoganson called The Heartland. And she breaks down this mythology of the heartland as an insular, unchanging, and parochial space. And she says, not so. This is a space, the Midwest is fluid and it's globalized. And I think we can see that by examining farms and food, this is the case. Some of the images that I am going to be showing today come from a course that I taught a few years ago and were selected by students to represent Midwestern history and particularly Iowa history. And you will see a number of these images come from the Iowa Museum and from the vault. And we're very lucky to be able to see these. Mark Kerlansky, who is a food writer, wrote about the Federal Writers Project. It was a New Deal project called America Eats in the 1930s. And the writers of the project collected recipes, stories, and essays in order to preserve regional foodways. Although the war interrupted the effort and the manuscripts were not published, Kerlansky ran across them in an archive and has gathered them into a book called The Food of a Younger Land. In the section, The Middle West Eats, he has recipes and stories. Most of the material is about Kansas, Nebraska, Minnesota, and it represents indigenous, immigrant, rural, and urban foodways. The local foodways of the Midwest are overlooked, Kerlansky says, and although today the cuisine has been ravaged by fast food, it was a region with a very strong sense of its own food. It was a simple food based on local products and local traditions. The traditions came from towns, from immigrants, and they were based on home-cooked food and not restaurants. Kerlansky also remarked that Midwesterners had an ability to be self-deprecating, as is evident with the poem in the collection titled "Nebraskans Eat the Wieners." And I would say that Midwesterners have continued to have self-deprecating humor. All you have to do is look at the products that Raygun sells here, making commentary on the Midwestern salad. So let's begin in the late 19th century. This is an image from a farm family in Indiana in the late 19th century. You can see this is a pretty big operation with 4 different hogs being butchered at the same time. The Hammer family is prepared to cure meat. They are prepared to make lard, gelatin, to break down these hogs into many different pieces and parts that will be used over the course of a year. At the same time, in farm communities, we have people like Jessie Shambaugh, who is organizing. She's a teacher from Shenandoah, Iowa, and she is organizing children, perhaps the same kinds of children that are working on the Hammer farm, into corn clubs and home clubs, defined by gender, but teaching agricultural skills with a scientific background. These clubs will go on to become 4-H, which enriched local life and promoted the education of both agricultural and domestic sciences. So in the late 19th century, farms in the Midwest were quite diverse. A farm family would have animals that pulled the tractor, as you would see here in this 1902 John Deere model, and would have various animals. You can see horses and mules and pigs and cattle, all in this Nebraska farm image. The diversity of the farm wasn't just with animals, but it was with the crops that are grown. These are some turn of the century seed catalogs from a seed company in Rock Island, Illinois. And these beautiful catalogs would be mailed out to potential buyers in the winter to peruse and to make plans for their gardens. And if we look at a typical kind of menu, this is Living History Farms here in the Des Moines area. This is their 1900 menu for the farm. And you can see that well represented here would be pork, but also chicken, potatoes, cabbage, bread, items that would come directly from the farm, items that could be picked off of trees, milk that could be turned into butter, and cabbages and beans that could be grown in the garden. And so at the end of the 19th century, most farmers are able to eat with a lot of sustenance. They're able to provide a lot for themselves, and they have a diverse array of items that they are producing on the farm. But there are changes. There are changes, and we can see this here in these images. This is Chicago. These are the stockyards in Chicago. There are 3 places that are controlling the majority of meat packing. And Iowa, for example, was all about pigs and corn. And Chicago had an incredible influence on what happened in Iowa. Kansas City and Omaha were the other 2 places. So between these 3 cities, the majority of Americans began to get their meat not directly from a farmer, but to get their meat from a meat packing facility in one of these major cities. So what does this mean for the woman who is cooking at home and her knowledge that she has? And how does her knowledge change? This is Mrs. Welch's cookbook from 1884. Mary B. Welch was a domestic economics instructor at Iowa State. And this cookbook represents a shifting knowledge for women who knew how to pack meat, maybe they didn't butcher at home anymore, but they knew how to salt a pork and put it away for the winter. But at the same time, they also now had access to meat from a butcher in town. And so how does this look? So first, she instructs women on marketing. So how to go to the market and find the best cuts of meat and the best eggs and the best lettuce, and how to know to pick from a butcher or from a shop owner, how to pick the best food. And so this is one step removed from production. But at the same time, she also has information that show women know what to do should they get a very large chunk of meat. Here we have a leg of mutton, for example, and she explains exactly how to break down a leg of mutton. And here in the pork cake, we can see that should you be working with a large piece of pork, you'll have leftovers. Here's how you make a cake. Women are still buying whole cabbages and then pickling them at home. Here we have instructions for that. We would see at this time, we see festivals representing much of the ethnic origins of Iowans and Midwesterners. Here we have Sauerkraut Day in what used to be Germania, Iowa, was renamed during the war to Lakota, Iowa. And here is in 1912, a picture of Sauerkraut Day. Whether it is Germans or Scandinavians, indigenous peoples, we see that the food of the region is influenced by ethnicities and immigration. Here we see German donuts in her 1884 book, how to make Krapfen. And you can see here that she is indicating most of these items would be fresh. They would come, the cream, for example, that women would have lard on hand that might even be produced domestically. But there's also a lemon, and that is going to come from California, perhaps. We see the influence of globalization on food. Here we have Spanish rice. This is a Wisconsin diary. This Spanish rice is made with bacon because Spanish rice in the Midwest always has bacon, although it certainly is not how it would be made in Spain. The amount of work that it would take to produce something for consumption, something special like an alcoholic beverage of root beer. You see here, we think of burdock. We think of dock as an invasive species today, but to Welch in 1884, you could combine this with hops and sarsaparilla and some spruce, and you could ferment it, and you could have a cask full of delicious root beer And of course, people would have known exactly what it meant to say, leave out the bung for the scum to overflow. And we still see that people know how to use the wild for food. And so in 1884, she has a recipe for a hickory nut cake. People could collect hickory nuts and make this cake. So what women or what Midwesterners know at the turn of the century about food is more direct, more intimate, but it is becoming more removed. And so here we see this is a farm market in East Village of Des Moines in about 1909. You can see that there are carts of wagon full of watermelons there. There are carts of potatoes. There are beets. There are baskets of produce, both at the farm stands as well as on the arms of shoppers. And women would know at this time how to sniff and to prod and to press to find a good chicken or a ripe tomato. Meat disappears from backyards and even from many farmyards for domestic consumption the most quickly because of the meatpacking industry. Of course, pigs are still so important in Iowa. Here you see this 1903 poster from the fair. And what is this pig called? This pig is called a mortgage lifter. There's also a tomato that in the 1930s during the Depression that was also called a mortgage lifter. It was like a big beefsteak tomato. And so pigs are still extremely important, but not everybody is butchering pigs at home. They are more likely to go to a butcher and to buy them. And here we see in 1910 an image of the Cudahy meatpacking plant in Omaha, where they are making pork sausages. As food is indirectly or is not directly consumed, and there are middlemen steps in the process, advertisers move into that gap. And they fill that gap. At first, in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, they fill that gap with information. And so you see that this Kellogg's ad is full of text and to inform and to explain. And you see that we still have a woman in a cornfield because the consumer of this product may actually still know how to grow corn, even if she isn't doing it anymore. Soon advertisements will change so that there is no direct association to the place or to the production. And so here in the 1930s, we can see that these pickles from California, the only information you have here is that consuming these pickles would be like consuming the pickles that elite people eat. It doesn't have a connection to a farm field. So as people began to move into professional lives and move into town, their knowledge changes tremendously. And so here, let's take the example of Clara Skeen Stott. She was born in Iowa. She lived in the Midwest and in China. She was educated at Iowa State. She was a journalist. And she has in her album, which is in the archive, she has a number of images of her childhood growing up and on the farm, all of the different activities for making food. And so here we have making cider. This is a cider press, mushing up the apples. Apples were very important. They were important mostly for making cider, but also for making pies, for baked goods. Apples could be dehydrated and used later in the year. The most famous apple in the world is actually of Iowa origin. The Red Delicious comes from a Jesse Hyatt's farm in Madison County, Iowa in the late 19th century. He decides he's got a pretty good apple. It's just a tree that grew up in his field, and he kept mowing it, but it kept coming back, so he let it grow. And he sent it off to a competition, and it became the Red Delicious apple marketed by the Stark brothers in Missouri. This is the apple that is at the root of many other apples. So the Golden Delicious comes from the Red Delicious. Apples used to be so, there used to be so many different varieties of apples. When you plant seeds from a Red Delicious, you don't necessarily get Red Delicious trees. And so they are wild seeds that don't come true to the tree that they came off of. And so there was great variety of apples. Every farm may have had its own variety developing, and you would need to graft apples in order to have a specific kind. And the Red Delicious becomes that kind. It was eminently shippable with its thick skin, and it was very sweet, and it met important needs for an industrializing economy in the 20th century. And here we see a quilt from the museum collection that shows apple blossoms. Here we have Scott on her family's farm picking cherries. Women would can these cherries, put them up so that they would be available at other times during the year. And here we have the kids playing with the milk pails. Many local farms had cows so that milk, but importantly butter, could be made. And here come the hickories again. So we have the 1884 recipe for hickory cake. Here in 1917, we have the family picking hickories in order to possibly make a cake. As she gets older, she spends time, she moves to Wisconsin, and she has a summer home in Minnesota. And this is an image taken from her travels in Minnesota. This would be the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe who are collecting rice. Most likely this is very near White Earth in Northwest Minnesota. This is an example of a crop that has become highly industrialized. Most people who eat wild rice, as it is called, are eating something that is commercially grown either in Minnesota or in California. And so early 20th century farmers would have perused catalogs, again, looking for these new fancy crops, better varieties of seeds. And then World War I happens. Iowa's Herbert Hoover becomes the director of the Food Administration, and he works to coordinate what is happening on farms and in kitchens with what is happening on the front in Europe. And so this double front, the home front and the war front in Europe, it is very important that he speak to women and that he encourage them to eat certain kinds of foods, to eat potatoes, to grow vegetables, and to eat less meat, wheat, sugar, and fats, or to find alternatives for them. Here we see this J. Ding Darling cartoon from 1917 during the war. Uncle Sam is about to smack the kid in the sugar barrel because he should be restricting his sugar intake, just like the good little kids there next to Uncle Sam who have gone wheatless and meatless. And so diets changed tremendously during World War I in order to accommodate the needs of war. Women planted gardens, and here we see a poster encouraging women to grow gardens. And so women who may have left the farm, who may no longer be practicing agriculture are encouraged to use that knowledge and to go back and to plant a munition plant, as it says. And here we have another J. Ending Darling cartoon, one in which he says that women are growing so many potatoes that the potato companies have been taken down. The women are like gladiators in their gardens. After the war, the radio proliferates in American homes. Now, there is a big difference between the 1920s for farms and for cities. And so the majority of urban families will have electricity. The majority of rural families will not. But by the 1930s, with the help of the Rural Electrification Administration, there will be increased electricity coming to farms and rural areas. But the radio becomes extremely important to Midwesterners and helps to create a kind of sense of national culture. And advertising on the radio is very important in that process. We also have the creation of the electric oven in 1927. This is made by General Electric in Burlington, Iowa. And we also have the first monitor top refrigerator. This is also made by General Electric in, let's see, now this is made in Burlington, Iowa, sorry, and in 1927. And this is a game changer for kitchens and for diets. The ability to save food, not needing to go to the market every day for fresh food, the ability to keep milk, and so with the coming of electricity, formerly the icebox, now the plug-in, reliable, as the company slogan said, it makes it safe to be hungry, preventing food from spoiling. This is a significant game changer for women's work in the kitchen, as well as for their work in the garden and on the farm, and it changes diets. A lot of these appliances are made in Iowa. This is a bread slicer. This is the first bread slicer. It was made in Davenport, Iowa in 1928. Also a game changer. Women devoted a lot of time to baking bread. Bread is something, and cakes were something commonly remarked on in Welch's cookbook in the 1880s. But the ability to purchase store-made bread and to have it sliced, this saved a lot of time and was very convenient for families. We also have the creation of varieties that will ship. So this peach variety, its name is called the shipper. And it's called the shipper because it will stay firm and it can be shipped across country by railroad. And so these kinds of trends in diet, the coming of new technologies that allow for to keep food, this is happening at the same time that more people are moving into cities. And with those radios, we have people listening to a new radio show on KMA Radio coming out of Shenandoah, Iowa, called Kitchen Clatter. And here you see Leanna Field Driftmeyer, the Field family. Her brother has a seed company, and she is has this radio program. It's food podcasters today have called this the original food podcast. And she would be on the radio for, say, 30 minutes a day, chatting about domestic issues, sharing recipes. And she will also start a magazine about 10 years later. This radio program and this magazine run in part with Driftmeyer and then later with a whole host of other people for 60 years. And so this is the longest running homemaker show in American history. And I'll also say, just a side note, that Driftmeyer was in a wheelchair for most of this. She hosted the program eventually from her home so that she could stay in her convenient environment. Her program through the Depression helped with the idea of making do. And this was something that farm women and urban women alike learned how to do. They did this during the war, they did this during the Depression, they would do so again during the war. One of the ways that the average rural family gained a little bit of cash was from the sale of eggs and chickens. And so here we see an egg basket from the museum collection and an apron that is made from a flour sack. And so this is part of making do. Women would sell eggs, but they also sold chickens. And so we see in Kitchen Clatter, we see the discussion of how to raise chickens. We see advertisements to order chickens. And we see discussion of hen parties, women bringing their best chickens all together and then having a buyer come and buy from all of them at once. And the sale of eggs and chickens is where the phrase egg money comes from, that cash on hand that was so important to farm families. Kitchen Clatter by the end of the 30s is available in a number of places throughout the Midwest, Kansas, Minnesota, not just in Iowa. World War II. This is a letter. This is a letter from John Graham from Minnesota, and he's writing home to his farm family. He is serving in Italy, and he says that he is dreaming of eating pork tenderloin and ham and eggs. And he says, I know that you guys aren't eating that either because you're rationing, but boy, do I really dream about that. He says, I'm getting plenty of meat here in the military. So the quality is plentiful, but the quantity is very poor. He says, and I quote, largely processed in cans, corned beef, sausages, luncheon loaf, etc., canned salt pork, bacon that is lousy. And so all of that rationing that happens during World War II is to transfer calories and to transfer certain kinds of calories to the war front, to people like John Graham. And what that means on the domestic front is, again, something like World War I, but on a larger scale. And so the federal government worked to encourage women to plant gardens, to encourage women to learn agricultural skills, to learn how to can. Here we see Henry Wallace of the prominent Wallace family of Des Moines. He is here in his victory garden tending his tomatoes, cabbages, and corn. And he is when this photo is taken, he's the vice president, but he's formerly also the Secretary of Agriculture. And after the war, he will run for president. He's also the founder of Hybrid, or what becomes Pioneer Hybrid, which is an extremely significant agricultural company that contributes to industrialization over the 20th century by producing higher yields for farmers. Corn jumps from the 1930s to the 1980s from 24 bushels to about 100 bushels per acre. So productivity is increasing. And during the war, we have then this encouragement for women to garden. Again, perhaps many people have this skill already, but there were always pamphlets available to teach women who didn't know how to farm. We also have the creation of the the creation of the Women's Land Army. Oh, and so canning. This was you can see two things here. You can see a poster encouraging women to do industrial work, to move into a cannery, to a factory environment in order to do work for the war effort. But it is sold, this kind of work is sold as being in the ken, in the wheelhouse of women, because yes, it's factory work and it's wage labor, but it's to can tomatoes. And so that's something that you would already know how to do. And then the picture here is from 1945, the Rhinebeck Canning Company in Grundy County. It looks like they are canning green beans. And so you have the idealized image as well as the actual image. So the Women's Land Army engages hundreds of thousands of women to learn how to do agricultural work, many of them. This Life magazine cover from 1943 shows a woman in Minnesota who is working on the farm. And the idea of the Women's Land Army was that with so many men taking up arms and leaving the farm, people were needed. And in this instance, it would be women. People were needed to move into and take up those positions. And so you can see how this, in this poster from the Iowa Museum, that this is sold, is that factory work is equivalent, excuse me, farm work is equivalent to fighting. This is a tractor that is similar to one that would be common on the farm after World War II. What we see happen after World War II is a trend. So the technology of the tank is applied domestically to agricultural farm implements. And so if we just go back to this poster again, the idea that the tank and the tractor are similar is not just an idea to promote work during the war, it is also a technological transfer. And so tractors begin to proliferate. What happens in the over the course of the first half of the 20th century is that tractors mean less labor is needed. And so all of those, the lighter colored, the Midwest here, what we see is farm consolidation. This map from the Census Bureau shows us that we're seeing intense consolidation of farms in the Midwest. This also means that people are farmers are replacing their draft horses, replacing their mules with tractors. And so here we can see this Grundy County farmer. He is unharnessing a team of horses. And this is precisely the kind of farmer who would invest in a tractor. And here we see US Census data that shows us that the point at which there are as many tractors as there are horses on farms is at the end of World War II. And after that, horses will continue to decline and tractors will continue to increase. And in addition to that, we do have these higher yield seeds that are being sold by companies. And so this seed bag from Pioneer, although this is actually from 1970, this is an example of the match of efficient seeds with higher yields and the new technologies in the post-war era for tractors. So fewer and fewer people are needed to be on the farm. Labor changes mean that you just don't need as many people to farm a larger acreage. And we begin to see some harkening back some idyllic images then, and we can see that in the regionalism of Grant Wood. Here we have the small town, the garden, the fruit trees, harkening back to a time when farmers were more reliant upon sustenance and are now moving into more urbanized environments and taking a little bit of the farm with them. During this time, we also start to see the Permar Toy Company in Maquoketa. These toys are found in the Smithsonian and of course in the Iowa Museum's collection. Peter Marr made these little toys out of wood, and here you can see there are milk jugs in the back of the wagon. And this represents also an interest in hearkening back to an era that many people are no longer directly reliant upon. No, people are not necessarily farmers. Milk, dairies, this is one of the other places that we see big changes. And we can see here the old milk carton, this would have milk jug, this pail would have weighed almost 100 pounds, would need to be lugged into the back of the wagon, and then would be delivered to people's homes directly. In the 1950s, the electric milker begins to change the way that milk happens. This is a much more efficient way to gather milk. It's also a big time saver. And let's return to kitchen clatter and check in and see what has happened in the interim years here. So in the 1950s and 1960s, what kinds of recipes and information are we seeing from Driftmeyer and Birkby and the others who are part of Kitchen Clatter? Well, we're still seeing advertisements for tomatoes, and this is, of course, from her brother's seed company. We're still seeing advertisements for flour and flour by the sack still, but we also see some hearkening back to the good old days. Come for the weekend to see the Long Winter Pageant based on Laura Ingalls Wilder. For sale are salad dressings and flavors. Lots and lots of artificial flavors are sold by Kitchen Clatter. You can see all of them. Instead of picking black walnuts, perhaps you will just purchase a bottle of the flavoring. And so now recipes call for gelatin. They call for flavoring. They call for packages of cream cheese, marshmallows. This is a recipe that you would make after going to the grocery store. But there's a holdover here. There is shortening, but there also are hickory nuts. The hickory nuts have held into the 1950s. In the 1930s, we began to see the proliferation of grocery stores, and Hy-Vee gets its start in the 1930s. This is a flyer from 1950 of the new Hy-Vee store that opens in Ames. And you can see that here you're going to buy flour, marshmallows, pork and beans, your vegetables, those hearty shipper peaches, everything, including your meat, will come from the grocery store. And we start to see advertisements for instant food in Better Homes and Gardens. And of course, we then begin to see very different kinds of recipes, again, focused on gelatins, bright colors, everything coming out of a package. So even if it is made from scratch, it comes from a package. But the cake really holds on. The importance of the cake, which in the 1950s, the ability to make an apple pie and a cake were considered the epitome of femininity. And so this is still present. But then we have in the 1950s, the Betty Crocker cake mixes. So now you can make a cake almost from scratch, as the advertisements assured women. And it tastes homemade. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the shift that we see in labor. So some food is still labor intensive. Not all food can be produced with a tractor. The places where labor intensive work goes as it leaves Iowa will be places like California, which is the most agricultural state in the nation today. But there are still some holdovers. So here you can see this is Muscatine. These are migrant laborers pickling cucumbers in Muscatine, Iowa. And Iowans, of course, understood their connection to, and they resisted just a little bit some of what was happening to this industrialized food system. And so here we can see a 1969 LULAC, flyer, which is advocating, this is based out of the Quad Cities, advocating to participate in the Great Boycott. And we also have this supporting comment that comes from an NAACP brochure saying that the NAACP supports the boycott as well. And so people are becoming more removed from their food and have lost a lot of knowledge, but occasionally we see this resistance, as in the labor movement. And then sometimes people just ate a TV dinner. TV dinners proliferate in the 1950s with the television, and then in Amana, Iowa, the first microwave will be made in the 1960s. This is the 1974 version of the radar range. And now the cookbooks tell us how to make food in a microwave. And so, boy, have things changed from Mrs. Welch time in 1884. Now, one can just purchase cookies instead of using a recipe to bake them. And what we begin to see happening in Iowa is that local food becomes something that is eaten at a festival or on a special occasion, like at a sweet corn festival. West Point started one in the 1950s. This is Urbana, Illinois' first festival in the 1970s. And so ethnic food, regional food, local food becomes something that is consumed on special occasions as a part of festivals or ethnic events. And in the big picture, what has happened is that Iowa has come to produce only a few select things. And those things, corn and soybeans, as you see, very important, become the backbone to the industrial food system that everyone else is relying on. But what I want to make sure that we understand and to make clear is that what has changed most dramatically is actually the diet of the farms and the region itself. Food writer Michael Pollan says that an Iowa farmer can't feed himself because although we sit in one of the world's great food baskets, the corn and the soy is not edible by humans, but it does end up going to the tables through pork or chicken or beef, and it also becomes an essential ingredient in processed foods, the corn and the soy does. And that is, of course, what is considered the iconic American diet. So I will stop there, and I would be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Amaya. We have a few minutes to answer some questions at this time. However, before I pose our first question, I want to remind our participants that you can still submit your questions to the Q&A feature. As always, we're on a schedule though, so please note we may not be able to get to all the questions before the end of the webinar. So here's the first question for you. What happened to the industrialized diet in the last 50 years? Any challenges?
So I think I would say that exactly what I just described, where Iowa becomes it lacks its farm diversity. No longer do families have lots of different kinds of animals. Are they producing multiple crops? Especially in the 1970s and the 1980s, we begin to see farm consolidation so that farms are getting bigger and bigger and families are leaving the farm. So part of this is our policy changes, like Earl Butz when he was Secretary of Agriculture his famous phrase was that farmers should go big or get out, and they should plow fence row to fence row. So the tractors get bigger, the farms get bigger. And this has, of course, an effect on the American diet, is that the more commodity corn or commodity soy that is produced, the more people are going to be eating of it. And so this is a big shift in the diet. We also have in the early 80s, the invention of high fructose corn syrup. Maybe it's the late 70s. And high fructose corn syrup is in so much stuff. And it is, it is a backbone of industrial food supply. And it isn't just people in cities in America that are eating this. It is, of course, this region as well. And you might be familiar with the term food desert. Although that's kind of a misnomer, the idea is that there are places that are very far away from fresh food, places to get fresh vegetables and whole foods. And ironically, most of our rural areas are like that. That despite the fact that this is where calories are grown that are not eaten by humans, farmers themselves do not have access to grocery stores without driving 50 miles, for example, to fresh food. And so if we think back to what the diet of this region was like in the late 19th century, that's the most dramatic shift.
Our next question is from Mara. I'm interested in the period of transition you described when Midwestern women were both directly involved in food production and starting to have access to other sources. Are there any historical records that help us understand how the women saw this blend as favorable, disorienting?
That's a great question. So you're absolutely right that in the early 20th century, there's this a shift that happens. Going to town meant that you could purchase items in bulk that you might have to make on the farm otherwise. Farm women having access in the 1930s increasingly to electricity and to appliances, labor-saving appliances, washing machines, for example. This changes day-to-day life tremendously. And I would recommend looking at cookbooks. The Kitchen Clatter is available for about a 50-year span of time. And you can see in the 1930s already that recipes are calling for a can of corn. And so the production of a dish with corn wouldn't necessarily be reliant upon having to, grow, pick, process corn a year in advance, that you could just have that can of corn. And that transition to accepting canned goods does take a little bit of time from the late 19th century into the early 20th century because people didn't initially trust factory food. But advertisements convinced them through information, through the cow in the beautiful pasture, that canned milk was safe. So it did take a generation for that transition to happen. But I think the cookbooks help to show that the way that food is thought of as something that is seasonal, and then pretty soon people are eating out of season. Kitchen Clatter, has recipes for things that were once very seasonal and it's just year round. And even things that were special, things like pineapple. Pineapple becomes very common. There are so many different pineapple recipes in the 1960s, I think, is when you start to see them proliferate.
Now, I know we both love cookbooks. So is there a recipe or type of food you have come across in your research that's no longer popular, but you think it should see a resurgence on our table?
How about the root beer?
Yeah.
Homemade root beer. There's also recipes for ginger beer. Some of the drinks that were associated with summertime, and in the 1880s, a cold drink in the summer was a pretty big deal. And it meant that you needed to have ice that was cut from a river in the winter time and then kept in sawdust underground. And in order to be able to have a block of ice in the summer meant thinking ahead 6 months. And that I think I look at those recipes for what are considered these kind of delicacy cold drinks in the summer, and some of them, you know, the ginger, the root beer, the mint, that would be found, you know, using local ingredients, but then also bringing in perhaps something special from afar, like the citrus, and then that on ice. I think that is representative of a kind of delicacy, late 19th century delicacy that we take for granted that we can get a cold drink today.
That's a fantastic choice. I agree. So our last question today, do you have any upcoming projects you want to share?
Well, I do hope to use these images to create a visual essay for the Annals of Iowa, to share some of these images from the collection that students have highlighted. So you saw some of these already, and I just think they tell a really rich story about everyday life, and that food on the table, it represents cultural shifts and social shifts, but it also represents environmental shifts and technological shifts. And I think we can use food to tell us about so many other things. So I hope to be able to share that with readers of the Annals of Iowa.
Perfect. We look forward to it. And with that answer is all the time we have for today's webinar. I think we can all agree this has been a very informative lunch, and I'm also very hungry now. So happy to take lunch after this. Also, thank you to everyone joining us today. Hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History Month webinars on Tuesdays and Thursdays in March this month. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. Now, for more information and to register for future webinars in the series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. And while you're there, you can look into some of our other fantastic digital programming, such as our Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Story series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. We look forward to virtually seeing you here again Thursday, March 11th for our 4th Iowa History Month webinar. Thanks, everyone.